Long before cities or borders, the land that is now Canada was a wild and untamed frontier, shaped by ice, time, and nature's power. More than 12,000 years ago, during the final stages of the Ice Age, massive glaciers covered most of the region. Towering walls of ice stretched across the land, carving valleys, forming lakes, and shaping the rugged landscapes we see today, from the Rocky Mountains in the west to the Great Lakes in the east. As the Earth's climate slowly warmed, the glaciers began to melt. Rivers like the St. Lawrence and Mackenzie burst forth, creating fertile plains, vast forests, and rich coastlines teeming with life. With the retreat of the ice came the arrival of people, the first inhabitants of Canada. Archaeologists believe these early peoples crossed a land bridge from Siberia into Alaska, known as Beringia, before gradually spreading across North America. Over thousands of years, they adapted to every environment this vast land offered. In the Arctic, the ancestors of the Inuit mastered survival in one of Earth's harshest climates. They built igloos from snow, hunted seals and whales, and traveled by kayak and dog sled across the frozen seas. Further south, the First Nations thrived across forests, plains, and coasts. In the Pacific Northwest, powerful nations like the Haida and Tlingit built great wooden totem poles and massive cedar longhouses. Their lives revolved around the ocean, rich with salmon, whales, and seals. Across the prairies, the Cree, Blackfoot, and Assiniboine followed herds of bison across the grasslands. They lived in portable teepees, perfect for a nomadic lifestyle tied to the rhythms of nature. In the eastern woodlands, along the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence River, nations like the Iroquois, Haudenosaunee, and Huron-Wendat cultivated corn, beans, and squash, the Three Sisters. They built fortified villages and formed powerful alliances, some of which became models for later democratic governments. And in the Atlantic region, the Mi'kmaq and Beothuk lived by the sea, fishing, hunting, and crafting tools from stone and bone. Across all these lands, the indigenous peoples developed unique languages, spiritual traditions, and art, yet shared a common respect for the land that sustained them. They saw the earth not as something to own, but as something sacred, a living relative to be honored and protected. By the time European explorers arrived, indigenous nations had already built complex societies connected by vast trade networks, exchanging furs, copper, shells, and knowledge across thousands of miles. This was not an empty wilderness. It was a living world, home to vibrant civilizations, each with its own stories, wisdom, and way of life. For thousands of years, these peoples lived in balance with the land, their deep connection to nature forming the spiritual and cultural roots of what would one day become Canada. For thousands of years, the indigenous nations of Canada flourished, each with their own languages, traditions, and ways of life. Long before European contact, they had built rich and sophisticated cultures rooted in deep respect for nature and community. Across this vast land, more than 600 distinct nations thrived, connected by trade routes, alliances, and shared wisdom passed down through generations. In the Pacific Northwest, nations like the Haida, Tlingit, and Coast Salish became renowned for their art and architecture. They built majestic cedar longhouses and carved towering totem poles, symbols of family, legend, and identity. Their ocean-based culture revolved around fishing, especially the sacred salmon, a gift of life that sustained entire communities. Further inland, on the Great Plains, nations such as the Cree, Blackfoot, and Assiniboine followed the vast herds of bison. Every part of the animal was used for food, clothing, shelter, and tools. The bison wasn't just a resource. It was a sacred partner in survival, honored in ceremony and song. In the eastern woodlands, near the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Valley, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also known as the Iroquois Confederacy, built one of the world's earliest models of democracy. 5 great nations, the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, joined together under a great law of peace, governed by councils and guided by consensus. Their influence would later inspire political thinkers, even those who helped shape the democratic systems of the United States and Canada. To the north, the Inuit thrived in the Arctic, where few others could survive. They built igloos for winter shelter, crafted kayaks for hunting across icy seas, and developed complex knowledge of weather, sea ice, and animal behavior, knowledge passed down orally through generations. On the Atlantic coast, nations like the Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, and Beothuk lived in harmony with the sea and forests. They built birch-bark canoes, traded along the coasts, and celebrated a deep spiritual connection with the land and its creatures. Trade linked them all together, a vast network stretching from the Pacific to the Atlantic, from the Arctic tundra to the Great Plains. Shells from the ocean, copper from Lake Superior, and obsidian from the Rockies were exchanged across thousands of kilometers, proof of thriving economies long before contact with Europe. Their cultures were guided by a powerful belief that everything, the rivers, trees, animals, and sky, had a spirit. They lived not to dominate the land, but to coexist with it. When European explorers first arrived in the late 1400s, they did not discover an empty land. They encountered a continent alive with nations, languages, and traditions thousands of years old. These were the first peoples of Canada, the true guardians of the land, whose legacy continues to shape the heart and soul of the nation today. By the late 15th century, Europe was entering an age of discovery. Nations like Spain, Portugal, France, and England were sending ships across uncharted oceans, searching for new trade routes, wealth, and territory. In 1497, the English explorer John Cabot, sailing under the flag of King Henry VII, reached the coast of Newfoundland. He was one of the first Europeans to set foot in what is now Canada. Cabot reported waters so full of fish that his crew could simply drop baskets overboard and pull them up brimming with cod. These rich fishing grounds soon drew fleets from England, France, Portugal, and Spain to the Grand Banks, some of the most productive fisheries in the world. Not long after, the French joined the race for discovery. In 1534, the French explorer Jacques Cartier sailed up the mighty St. Lawrence River, claiming the land for King Francis I of France. He met the St. Lawrence Iroquoians, who welcomed him with trade and curiosity. Cartier named the new territory Canada, derived from the Iroquoian word Kanata, meaning village or settlement. Over the next century, France established a foothold in North America, founding the colony of New France. Explorers like Samuel de Champlain, often called the father of New France, helped build the first permanent settlements, including Quebec City in 1608. Champlain forged strong alliances with indigenous nations, especially the Algonquin and Huron-Wendat, trading European goods like iron tools, muskets, and beads for furs, which became the foundation of the colonial economy. The fur trade soon transformed everything. It drew trappers, traders, and missionaries deep into the wilderness, along rivers and forests stretching thousands of miles. Beaver pelts became so valuable in Europe that they were nicknamed soft gold. But not all was peaceful. As French influence spread, rival indigenous alliances formed, and conflicts grew between European powers competing for land. Narrator. After the fall of New France, Britain ruled over a vast and diverse territory. French-speaking Canadians lived mainly along the St. Lawrence River, while English-speaking settlers grew in number throughout the Atlantic colonies and western frontiers. But the story of how these regions became one nation was far from simple. It was a journey filled with conflict, vision, and determination. In 1776, the American Revolution erupted to the south. The 13 colonies broke away from Britain to form the United States. Thousands of people loyal to the British Crown, known as Loyalists, fled north, settling in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Quebec, and Ontario. Their arrival changed everything. They brought English laws, institutions, and a new sense of identity as British North Americans. By the early 1800s, tensions between English and French populations, and between colonies themselves began to grow. Rebellions broke out, first in Upper Canada, now Ontario, and Lower Canada, now Quebec, in 1837 and 1838. The rebels demanded responsible government and more freedom from British control. Though the uprisings failed, they sent a clear message. The colonies wanted change. In response, Britain sent Lord Durham, whose famous report recommended uniting Upper and Lower Canada to create a more stable government. In 1841, they were merged into the province of Canada, but deep cultural divisions remained. Still, a new idea was beginning to take shape, the idea of confederation. Leaders like Sir John A. Macdonald, Georges-Étienne Cartier, George Brown, and Charles Tupper dreamed of creating a self-governing federation, a new country that could stand strong beside Britain and resist the influence of the United States. After years of debate and negotiation, their vision became reality. On July 1, 1867, the Dominion of Canada was born, uniting Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia under one flag. Sir John A. Macdonald became Canada's first Prime Minister, and the new nation began its journey toward independence. Though still part of the British Empire, Canada now had its own parliament, laws, and growing sense of identity. The birth of Canada wasn't just a political event. It was the beginning of a dream, a country built on unity, cooperation, and hope. But this new dominion was only the start. Ahead lay the challenges of expansion, diversity, and defining what it truly meant to be Canadian. After Confederation in 1867, the new Dominion of Canada was still small, just 4 provinces along the eastern coast. To survive and thrive, Canada needed to expand westward, connect its distant regions, and build a sense of unity across thousands of miles of wilderness. Under the leadership of Prime Minister Sir John A. Macdonald, the government dreamed of a nation that stretched from sea to sea. But that dream came with immense challenges. In 1870, Canada purchased the vast Hudson's Bay Company territories, a massive region known as Rupert's Land, covering much of today's Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and the Northwest Territories. The Indigenous peoples and Métis who lived there, however, were not consulted. When surveyors arrived to divide the land, tensions exploded. Led by Louis Riel, the Métis people of the Red River settlement resisted Ottawa's control. They demanded recognition of their land, culture, and language rights. Riel's movement led to the creation of Manitoba in 1870, but the conflict marked the beginning of a long struggle for Indigenous and Métis rights in Canada. Meanwhile, the government pushed forward with an ambitious project, the construction of a transcontinental railway that would link the east to the west. It was one of the most challenging engineering feats of its time, crossing prairies, forests, and the towering Rocky Mountains. Thousands of workers, including many Chinese laborers, toiled under brutal conditions, carving tunnels and laying tracks through impossible terrain. Many lost their lives, but their sacrifice made the dream of a united Canada possible. As the railway neared completion, new provinces joined the Confederation: British Columbia in 1871, Prince Edward Island in 1873, and later Alberta and Saskatchewan in 1905. Immigrants from Europe, Asia, and Eastern Canada poured into the prairies to farm the land and build new communities. Towns rose where only open plains once stood, but this rapid expansion came at a heavy cost. Indigenous nations were forced onto reserves through treaties that were often unequal or broken. Traditional hunting grounds disappeared, and many Indigenous peoples faced poverty, disease, and loss of culture. The government also began policies that would later bring deep pain, including the creation of residential schools, designed to assimilate Indigenous children by erasing their languages and traditions. So while Canada grew in size and power, it also carried wounds that would take generations to heal. Still, the young nation stood proud, united by rails, by resilience, and by a shared dream of progress. The foundations of modern Canada were set, but its identity was still taking shape. After Confederation in 1867, the new Dominion of Canada was still small, just 4 provinces along the eastern coast. To survive and thrive, Canada needed to expand westward, connect its distant regions, and build a sense of unity across thousands of miles of wilderness. Under the leadership of Prime Minister Sir John A. Macdonald, the government dreamed of a nation that stretched from sea to sea. But that dream came with immense challenges. In 1870, Canada purchased the vast Hudson's Bay Company territories, a massive region known as Rupert's Land, covering much of today's Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and the Northwest Territories. The Indigenous peoples and Métis who lived there, however, were not consulted. When surveyors arrived to divide the land, tensions exploded. Led by Louis Riel, the Métis people of the Red River settlement resisted Ottawa's control. They demanded recognition of their land, culture, and language rights. Riel's movement led to the creation of Manitoba in 1870. But the conflict marked the beginning of a long struggle for Indigenous and Métis rights in Canada. Meanwhile, the government pushed forward with an ambitious project, the construction of a transcontinental railway that would link the East to the West. It was one of the most challenging engineering feats of its time, crossing prairies, forests, and the towering Rocky Mountains. Thousands of workers, including many Chinese laborers, toiled under brutal conditions, carving tunnels and laying tracks through impossible terrain. Many lost their lives, but their sacrifice made the dream of a united Canada possible. As the railway neared completion, new provinces joined the Confederation: British Columbia in 1871, Prince Edward Island in 1873, and later, Alberta and Saskatchewan in 1905. Immigrants from Europe, Asia, and Eastern Canada poured into the prairies to farm the land and build new communities. Towns rose where only open plains once stood, but this rapid expansion came at a heavy cost. Indigenous nations were forced onto reserves through treaties that were often unequal or broken. Traditional hunting grounds disappeared, and many Indigenous peoples faced poverty, disease, and loss of culture. The government also began policies that would later bring deep pain, including the creation of residential schools, designed to assimilate Indigenous children by erasing their languages and traditions. So while Canada grew in size and power, it also carried wounds that would take generations to heal. Still, the young nation stood proud, united by rails, by resilience, and by a shared dream of progress. The foundations of modern Canada were set, but its identity was still taking shape. As the new century dawned, Canada was growing fast, a young nation finding its place in the world. Cities were expanding, industries booming, and immigrants arriving from every corner of the globe. But the coming decades would test Canada's unity, courage, and character like never before. In 1914, the world plunged into World War I. Though still tied to the British Empire, Canada answered the call to arms. More than 600,000 Canadians enlisted to fight in Europe. They faced unimaginable conditions in the trenches of France and Belgium, where mud, gas, and gunfire ruled the battlefields. At Vimy Ridge in 1917, Canadian soldiers fought together under Canadian command for the first time. Against all odds, they captured the ridge, a victory that came at a terrible cost, but also marked a turning point. Vimy became a symbol of national pride, proof that Canada could stand tall on the world stage, not just as part of an empire, but as its own nation. When the war ended in 1918, over 60,000 Canadians had given their lives. The country mourned deeply, but also stood more united and self-confident than ever before. The 1920s brought growth and change, but also tension. Indigenous peoples still faced discrimination, and the promises of equality had not been fulfilled. Then came the Great Depression of the 1930s, a decade of hardship that tested the nation's resolve. Just as recovery began, another storm gathered. In 1939, World War II erupted, and once again, Canada answered the call. This time, as an independent nation making its own decision to go to war. Over 1 million Canadians served in the armed forces. They fought bravely in the Battle of Britain, the Italian campaign, and during the D-Day landings at Normandy in 1944. At home, the economy surged as factories produced weapons, ships, and supplies for the Allied cause. Women entered the workforce in record numbers, proving vital to the war effort and paving the way for social change. By the time victory came in 1945, Canada had earned international respect. No longer just a colony, it was now a nation defined by courage, sacrifice, and growing independence. The wars had forged a new identity, one built on cooperation, resilience, and peacekeeping. Canada emerged from the shadows of Britain and began to take its own place in the world. The century of war had transformed it from a dominion of empire into a people united by their own values and vision. After 2 world wars and decades of change, Canada stood on the edge of true independence. It had proven its strength, forged its own identity, and was ready to take full control of its destiny. In 1931, the Statute of Westminster was passed by the British Parliament. This law granted full legislative independence to Canada and other dominions, allowing them to make their own decisions without approval from London. Though Canada still recognized the British monarch as its symbolic head of state, the country was now, in practice, self-governing. The years that followed brought transformation. Canada welcomed millions of immigrants, rebuilt after war, and became a founding member of the United Nations in 1945, reflecting its growing role as a peacekeeping nation committed to global cooperation. In 1965, Canada unveiled a new symbol of unity, the maple leaf flag. For the first time, Canadians had a flag of their own, one that represented not an empire but a people. The red maple leaf became a symbol of pride, peace, and independence, instantly recognizable across the world. 2 years later, in 1967, Canada celebrated its centennial, 100 years since Confederation. From coast to coast, Canadians reflected on how far they had come, from small colonies to a vibrant, diverse nation, but the journey toward full independence was not yet complete. In 1982, under the leadership of Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau, Canada took its final step. The Constitution Act was passed, officially bringing the Canadian Constitution home from Britain, a process known as patriation. This act also introduced the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, guaranteeing fundamental rights for all citizens, freedom of speech, religion, equality, and justice under the law. It was a defining moment. Canada was now fully sovereign, a nation built on democracy, diversity, and compassion. Yet independence also came with reflection. Indigenous peoples, whose lands and cultures had been deeply affected by centuries of colonization, began demanding recognition and justice. Their voices grew stronger, calling for truth, reconciliation, and respect, an unfinished but essential part of Canada's story. By the early 1980s, Canada had finally stepped out of the shadow of empire, a proud, independent country standing on its own values and principles. The maple leaf now flew high, not just as a flag, but as a promise of freedom, equality, and unity for generations to come. Today, Canada stands as one of the world's most diverse and peaceful nations, a country built on cooperation, compassion, and respect. From the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic, and from the Great Lakes to the Arctic Circle, it's a land where cultures, languages, and traditions come together in harmony. Over the past few decades, Canada has embraced multiculturalism as a cornerstone of its identity. People from every part of the world have made this country their home, bringing their languages, cuisines, art, and beliefs. In 1971, Canada officially became the first nation in the world to adopt a policy of multiculturalism, recognizing that its strength lies in its diversity. Major cities like Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal are now global crossroads, where one can hear dozens of languages in a single neighborhood. Whether it's the Lunar New Year in Vancouver, Diwali in Toronto, or St. Jean-Baptiste Day in Quebec, every celebration adds a new color to the Canadian mosaic. At the same time, Canada continues to reckon with the deeper truths of its history. The voices of Indigenous peoples, the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, have grown stronger, calling for justice, respect, and reconciliation. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, launched in 2008, exposed the painful legacy of residential schools where thousands of Indigenous children were taken from their families. In recent years, Canadians have begun a national journey of remembrance and repair, acknowledging the past and striving for a future built on partnership and healing. Canada has also become a leader on the world stage. It is known for its peacekeeping missions, humanitarian work, and commitment to democracy and human rights. From mediating international conflicts to supporting global aid efforts, Canada's influence extends far beyond its borders, guided by the belief that strength and kindness can coexist. Economically, it is one of the world's most advanced nations, rich in resources, innovation, and opportunity. Yet its true wealth lies not in gold or oil, but in the spirit of its people, diverse, compassionate, and free. In modern Canada, two official languages, English and French, coexist with hundreds of others spoken by immigrant and Indigenous communities. It's a living testament to the idea that unity does not require uniformity, that people of many backgrounds can share one home, one land and one destiny, from coast to coast to coast. Canada continues to evolve, learning from its past, embracing its present, and looking toward a brighter, more inclusive future. This is the Canada of today, a nation that celebrates difference, honors tradition, and believes deeply in the values of peace, equality, and respect. From the frozen tundra of the Arctic to the rolling plains of the prairies, from the rocky shores of the Atlantic to the towering peaks of the Rockies, the story of Canada is the story of a land and its people. It is a journey that began thousands of years ago with the first peoples who lived in harmony with the earth, a connection that still beats at the heart of the nation today. It continued through the age of explorers, the rivalry of empires, and the birth of a young dominion forged in hope and determination. Through war and peace, challenge and triumph, Canada has become a symbol of resilience, unity, and compassion. It is a nation that has learned and continues to learn from its past. A nation built not by conquest, but by cooperation, not by division, but by dialogue, and not by power, but by peace. Today, the maple leaf flies high as a symbol of freedom, equality, and diversity, values that define the true North, strong and free. Canada's legacy is not only written in its history books, it lives in its people, in the artist who paints with the colors of two worlds, in the farmer who works the same soil as his ancestors, in the newcomer who arrives with dreams and courage, and in the Indigenous elder who keeps the flame of tradition alive for the generations to come. The story of Canada is not over. It is still being written every day, in every act of kindness, every word of reconciliation, every voice that joins in unity. From ancient roots to modern horizons, Canada stands as a reminder that greatness is not measured by might, but by heart. This is Canada, a land of hope, harmony, and humanity. The true North, strong, free, and forever growing.